What if the very moment an empath decides to finally stop living for others, and instead chooses themselves? Marks not peace, but the most disturbing psychological turning point of their entire life. Carl Jung, the legendary psychologist, uncovered a hidden pattern so strange, so unsettling, that he believed it revealed the true cost of endless self-abandonment. The full picture of this revelation will unfold as we continue, but for now, understand this: when an empath makes the choice to prioritize their own being, the outcome is never small. It either awakens authentic wholeness or exposes a lifetime of concealed self-betrayal. Jung described this pattern as a self-choice crisis. He observed that people with a heightened sensitivity, often those dominated by feeling functions, spent years suppressing themselves, carrying the needs of others, and silencing their own inner voice. But eventually, a breaking point arrived. At this threshold, they were forced into a decision: remain trapped in self-abandonment, or reclaim their path toward individuation, their true psychological development. What unsettled Jung most was not just the choice itself, but the aftermath. When empaths finally turned toward themselves, the change was not gentle or gradual. It was rapid, almost violent in its intensity. Jung called it individuation acceleration. The accommodating persona, once seen as their natural identity, began to dissolve. Buried needs surfaced, forgotten boundaries reappeared. Their authentic expression surged forward, sometimes overwhelming them entirely. And yet, this transformation came at a cost. Jung realized that this wasn't merely about one person deciding differently, it was about a complete unveiling. The moment an empath chose self-prioritization, relationships began to fracture. Those who had benefited from the empath's constant sacrifice often turned against them, calling them selfish, cold, or changed. In truth, what had changed was not the empath's heart, but their willingness to keep abandoning themselves. Jung saw this moment as a human crossroads. Would the empath integrate their lost self, moving toward wholeness? Or would they crumble under the guilt and pressure of reclaiming their individuality? This was why he documented it so carefully. It wasn't simply a personal awakening, it was a mirror showing the true nature of every relationship built on sacrifice. Before we dive deeper into this haunting discovery, make sure you subscribe to SYC Soul. Hit the notification bell so you never miss what's coming next, and share this video with someone who might recognize these patterns in themselves. Carl Jung's deeper insight into this pattern came from a patient whose life told the entire story in painful clarity. This individual possessed extraordinary sensitivity, a heightened awareness of others' emotions, and for decades, they lived only to accommodate. Their own needs were neglected, buried beneath years of serving everyone else. But then something happened. After long sessions of therapy, reflecting and uncovering layer by layer, the patient reached what Jung called the choice. For the first time, they decided to prioritize their psychological well-being over the comfort of others. What followed stunned Jung. Within mere weeks, the patient's carefully crafted, endlessly helpful persona began to collapse. The mask they had worn for decades of kindness, of sacrifice, of always being available dissolved before his eyes. Beneath it, something raw and authentic began to emerge. This was not a breakdown, but what Jung described as psychological metamorphosis. It was like a butterfly breaking free from a cocoon it had mistaken as its natural form. Buried desires rose to the surface, forgotten interests reignited. The patient began to express long-suppressed emotions, to draw boundaries, and to explore aspects of their personality they had abandoned for years. But this transformation did not arrive without consequences. As the patient chose themselves, their family and social network reacted with shock, even hostility. Suddenly deprived of the endless supply of accommodation, family members turned to guilt, criticism, and accusation. They called the patient selfish. They accused them of betrayal. What Jung realized in that moment was chilling. The patient's change didn't only reveal who they truly were, it revealed the hidden truth about the people around them. So many relationships that had seemed loving and supportive were exposed as dependent on one thing: the patient's willingness to abandon themselves. Jung documented how disturbingly predictable these responses were. He could almost forecast exactly which family members would lash out, which would guilt trip, and which would reject outright. It wasn't random, it followed unconscious contracts that had silently governed those relationships for years. This single case made Jung recognize a universal truth. When an empath finally chooses themselves, it doesn't just transform the individual. It shines an unforgiving light on the very foundation of their connections. The question then becomes, which relationships were built on genuine care, and which only survived on the sacrifice of the self? Keep listening, because Jung's next discovery revealed the hidden architecture behind this accommodation psychology and why many empaths live trapped in it without even realizing. Jung soon realized this pattern of self-abandonment wasn't accidental. It followed a system, a structure he came to understand as a psychological imbalance that empaths unconsciously build over years. In simple terms, highly sensitive individuals developed what could be called psychological imbalance syndrome. Their inner world was distorted. One part of their psyche became overdeveloped, while another was ignored completely. At the heart of this imbalance was the feeling function. Empaths used it to expertly sense, understand, and respond to the needs of others. But in the process, they neglected their own emotional needs and their personal growth. Jung found that this imbalance had three main components, three hidden mechanisms that explained why empaths could remain trapped in self-sacrifice for so long. The first was what he described as an external validation architecture. Over time, these individuals lost touch with their own preferences, boundaries, and values. Instead, their entire sense of worth became dependent on others' approval. They could read people with remarkable accuracy, understanding moods, desires, and needs, but when it came to themselves, they were strangers. Their inner compass was replaced by the reactions of those around them. The second component was something Jung called shadow accumulation pressure. He discovered that suppressed needs don't vanish. They don't dissolve or disappear. Instead, they pile up, forming what Jung referred to as shadow reserves. Desires, boundaries, natural anger, healthy selfishness, all of it gets buried in the unconscious. But this isn't harmless storage. It builds pressure, and that pressure often leaks out as depression, anxiety, physical symptoms, or unexplained emotional weight. The third component emerged when empaths finally chose themselves, and Jung referred to it as the compensatory individuation trigger. The psyche, after years of neglect, tries to restore balance all at once. It rushes suppressed parts into consciousness with such force that the empath experiences what Jung compared to an archaeological dig into their own personality. Suddenly, forgotten aspects of their nature erupt to the surface. They remember desires, talents, and even anger they thought no longer existed. But here is where the real struggle begins. Because empaths have been conditioned to believe that their worth is measured by sacrifice, the moment they prioritize themselves, guilt floods in. Deep, heavy guilt. They fear being selfish. They fear abandonment. They feel as though choosing their own needs is an act of betrayal. And this guilt, Jung warned, is the very weapon that often pulls them back into the same destructive patterns they're trying to escape. Carl Jung recognized that the most powerful force keeping empaths chained to self-abandonment wasn't external, it was internal. He called it the guilt complex. This was the deep psychological mechanism that convinced sensitive people that choosing themselves was wrong, even immoral. For years, the empath learns to measure worth by sacrifice. Every compliment for being kind, every thank you for being available, every quiet nod of approval reinforces the belief that selflessness equals love. But underneath, a darker message is absorbed. If you ever choose yourself, you will lose everything. This silent conviction becomes so deeply embedded that when the empath finally begins to prioritize their own needs, an avalanche of guilt pours in. Jung noted that this guilt was irrational, it had no grounding in reality. But the psyche does not distinguish between rational and irrational when it comes to emotional conditioning. For the empath, guilt felt like a moral failing, as though they were betraying not just others, but their very purpose of existence. And so, even after beginning individuation, many fell back into old habits, apologizing for their boundaries, softening their voice, and sacrificing their well-being all over again. What fascinated Jung was that guilt often disguised itself as love. An empath would say, "I just can't hurt them," or "they need me," or "I feel responsible." But Jung peeled back the layers and showed that, in reality, these were not signs of pure love, they were symptoms of guilt manipulation. Sometimes that manipulation came from outside, sometimes from inside, but the effect was the same: self-erasure. And yet, Jung insisted that facing this guilt complex was essential. Without confronting it, individuation could never fully take root. Because guilt wasn't just an obstacle, it was a test. It was the psyche's way of asking, will you collapse under the weight of old conditioning, or will you integrate your lost self and finally step into wholeness? Before I continue, I want to pause and ask you, the listener, are you connecting with these insights? Do you see parts of your own story reflected here? If yes, tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching this video from. I'd love to know how far Jung's wisdom is reaching today. And if you're finding value, admire the work being put into this. By giving your support, it helps us bring even more depth to these explorations. Now, let's press forward, because Jung's next revelation explains why some empaths never escape the cycle while others finally break free. According to Carl Jung, not every empath remains imprisoned in the cycle of sacrifice and guilt forever. Some break through. Some reach what he described as true individuation, a state where the self is no longer defined by the demands of others, but by its own inner center. Yet Jung noticed something vital. Escape was never accidental. It required certain conditions, both internal and external, to align. The first condition was awareness. Jung emphasized that no one could escape a trap they did not see. Until the empath recognized the patterns of self-abandonment, guilt, and external validation, they would unconsciously repeat them. Awareness, then, was the light that revealed the invisible strings pulling their behavior. The second condition was what Jung termed inner confrontation. This meant turning toward the shadow, the stored desires, anger, and forgotten needs, and facing them without shame. Many empaths feared this step, believing their hidden parts were dangerous or selfish. But Jung argued that these suppressed aspects were not enemies. They were fragments of the self, waiting to be reintegrated. Without reclaiming them, wholeness was impossible. The third condition was courage. Jung described individuation as a heroic journey, not a comfortable adjustment. Courage was needed to withstand the backlash from others when the empath finally stopped abandoning themselves. Friends might leave, family might judge, partners might resist, but the individual had to stand firm, or else collapse back into old habits. And finally, Jung insisted on the importance of meaning. He observed that those who successfully broke free often anchored their transformation in a higher purpose, whether it was creative work, spiritual growth, or simply living authentically. Meaning gave strength to endure the storms of change. Yet, Jung warned, the process was rarely smooth. It was filled with doubts, setbacks, and moments of loneliness. But every step forward created more clarity, more strength, and more authenticity. Slowly, the empath's life began to reflect who they truly were, rather than what others demanded them to be. Before I go further, let me remind you, if you're finding depth and resonance in Jung's wisdom, don't forget to subscribe to SYC Soul. Hit the notification bell so you won't miss upcoming explorations, and share this video with anyone who might need this message. Supporting the channel ensures that these insights continue reaching those who are searching for them. Now, the question arises, what happens when the empath embraces these conditions fully? Jung uncovered that this shift doesn't just transform the individual, it changes the very structure of their unconscious. Carl Jung taught that when an empath finally commits to individuation, something profound begins to happen beneath the surface. The unconscious, which has stored away years, sometimes decades of abandoned parts of the self, starts to reorganize. Jung described this as a structural shift within the psyche. The balance between persona, ego, and shadow begins to change, forcing the individual into a new relationship with their own depths. For many empaths, this restructuring is not gentle. Jung observed that when neglected aspects of the self return, they often do so with startling intensity. Anger that was suppressed for years may erupt suddenly. Desires long ignored may reappear with a sense of urgency. Forgotten talents may awaken, demanding expression. It can feel overwhelming, as if the psyche is flooded by voices long silenced. Jung reassured his patients that this eruption was not madness, but healing. The unconscious was not punishing them, it was restoring them. He compared it to an archaeological excavation. Each layer uncovered brought buried treasures of the self back into the light, even if the digging process was messy and painful. What had once been fragmented and hidden was being gathered into a more complete whole. Yet Jung also warned that this phase carried real dangers. If the empath resisted these returning parts, trying to shove them back into the unconscious, the pressure could manifest as depression, anxiety, or even physical symptoms. The psyche demanded acknowledgement. Suppressed emotions would not remain quiet once awakened. This was why Jung urged the practice of dialogue with the unconscious, whether through active imagination, journaling, or creative expression. By giving voice to the shadow, the individual could begin integrating it rather than being overwhelmed. Integration, Jung explained, was the key to stability. Without it, the empath might feel torn between their old self-sacrificing identity and their newly emerging authentic self. And here lies the paradox. As frightening as this restructuring could be, it was also the very proof of growth. The empath was no longer living in the numbness of accommodation. They were alive, dynamic, and becoming whole. Jung emphasized that this process was the very heart of individuation, the return of all that had been lost, finally reintegrated into a balanced self. Stay with me, because in the next insight, Jung revealed why this integration often changes not just the inner life of the empath, but the external world around them as well, sometimes in ways that are deeply unsettling. Carl Jung made a striking observation. When an empath begins the path of individuation, it is not only their inner life that shifts. Their outer world relationships, social circles, even the environments they inhabit begins to reconfigure in response. This is because the empath's old role, the one built on sacrifice and compliance, no longer exists, and the absence of that role exposes hidden truths in the world around them. For years, empaths often serve as emotional anchors in families, friendships, and partnerships. They are the peacemakers, the listeners, the ones who absorb tension so others can avoid discomfort. Jung pointed out that when this role is withdrawn, the entire balance of those systems collapses. Conflicts rise to the surface. Tensions once suppressed by the empath's silence suddenly erupt. The very people who seemed most comfortable in the relationship may now accuse the empath of changing, of no longer being the same person. Jung argued that these reactions were not signs of failure, but signs of truth. They revealed which relationships depended on authenticity and which depended on exploitation. Some connections deepen, grown stronger as both individuals adjust to honesty and mutual respect. Others, however, dissolve because they were never rooted in genuine care to begin with. This is why Jung described individuation as a process of social alchemy. The empath's transformation acts like fire, burning away illusions. What survives the fire is what is real. What is lost was never truly stable in the first place. But Jung acknowledged the pain of this process. To the empath, losing relationships, even unhealthy ones, can feel devastating. The guilt complex may resurface, whispering that perhaps they should return to their old role just to keep the peace. Here, Jung was firm. Peace built on self-erasure is not peace, it is quiet destruction. To reclaim the self meant accepting the risk of loneliness, at least for a time. Yet he also offered reassurance. He wrote that new relationships, ones built on authenticity and mutual respect, often emerge after the storm. It was as if clearing away false connections created space for something truer, more aligned with the whole self. And here lies another mystery Jung uncovered. Individuation doesn't just change who you are, it changes the very kind of people you attract into your life. Carl Jung often reminded his students and patients that individuation was not just about healing wounds or restoring balance, it was also about unlocking potential. When the empath finally integrates the parts of themselves long abandoned, something extraordinary begins to stir, an awakening of destiny, creativity, and meaning that had been suppressed for years. Jung noted that many empaths, once freed from the endless cycle of pleasing others, discover passions and talents that had been buried beneath sacrifice. The musician who had silenced their songs to be responsible begins to write again. The artist who had abandoned their canvas for family obligations picks up the brush. The thinker who had always been quiet suddenly shares insights that others find transformative. Individuation does not just restore balance, it ignites creation. But Jung insisted this wasn't simply about personal hobbies or self-expression. He believed the psyche was wired for purpose. When empaths reclaim their authentic selves, their creativity often points them toward what he called their teleological path, the unique direction their life is meant to take. In other words, individuation aligns the person with their destiny. Yet here too, the journey is not smooth. Jung observed that stepping into authentic purpose often attracts resistance, both from within and without. Old doubts resurface. Who am I to do this? What if I fail? What will people think? At the same time, external critics may attempt to pull the empath back into conformity, mocking their ambitions or minimizing their new focus. Jung's advice was clear. These challenges are signs that the path is real. Resistance reveals importance. And in the midst of this struggle, something else begins to emerge: meaning. Jung believed that meaning was the true antidote to suffering. When empaths lived in sacrifice, their lives felt heavy, directionless, and exhausting. But once they embraced their authentic path, even hardships began to feel worthwhile, because those hardships were in service of something real. Meaning transformed pain into growth, struggle into purpose. This was why Jung so often said that individuation was both a burden and a blessing. It stripped away illusions, it dismantled false peace, it forced confrontation with guilt and loss, but it also revealed the hidden gold of the psyche, the capacity to live a life of depth, authenticity, and destiny. Stay close, because in the next stage of Jung's insights, he explains how individuation not only impacts the empath's destiny, but also influences the collective unconscious, subtly shaping the world around them. Carl Jung's vision of individuation went far beyond the personal. He believed that every act of reclaiming the self had ripple effects, extending beyond the individual into what he called the collective unconscious. To Jung, the transformation of one empath was never isolated, it was part of a greater unfolding within humanity itself. He explained that each psyche is connected to deeper, shared patterns, the archetypes that shape human experience across cultures and generations. When an empath integrates their shadow, confronts their guilt, and embraces authenticity, they are not merely solving a private problem, they are participating in a universal drama, the timeless struggle between suppression and expression, conformity and truth, shadow and light. Jung observed that when people around an empath witness this transformation, they too are stirred. Sometimes they resist, feeling threatened by the authenticity they see. But sometimes they are inspired, realizing that they too have been living in self-abandonment. One person's courage becomes another's mirror. This is why Jung described individuation as both personal healing and collective service. By becoming whole, the individual indirectly invites others toward wholeness as well. Yet Jung did not romanticize this process. He acknowledged that society often resists those who break away from roles of accommodation. Systems of power, whether in families, workplaces, or communities, depend on certain people carrying the emotional weight. When an empath steps out of that role, Resistance can come not just from individuals, but from the collective as a whole. And yet, Jung argued, this very resistance proved the necessity of change. He even suggested that the world evolves through such individuals, people willing to bear the loneliness of authenticity so that new patterns can emerge. In his writings, he compared them to mythic figures, the wanderer, the hero, the sage. They are not separate from society, but society's very pioneers. For the empath, this realization changes everything. Their healing is not selfish. Their individuation is not abandonment of duty. It is a contribution, subtle but powerful, to the evolution of human consciousness itself. By reclaiming their authenticity, they place one more stone on the path toward a world where wholeness is possible for all. And this brings us to Jung's final insight, perhaps his most profound, that individuation, while deeply personal, is also the greatest gift one can give to humanity. Carl Jung concluded that, when the empath finally chooses themselves, it is a profound return to wholeness. This choice is not selfish. It is a conscious realignment of the psyche, a step toward balance, authenticity, and psychological completeness. The empath's gift sensitivity does not vanish, it transforms. Unconscious absorption becomes conscious compassion. Compulsive accommodation becomes deliberate care. Jung emphasized that the problem was never empathy itself. The problem was the absence of boundaries, the unregulated flow of giving without protection. Once boundaries are established, sensitivity is no longer depleted, it becomes renewable. Empaths who choose themselves do not lose the ability to connect. On the contrary, they gain the capacity to connect deeply and authentically, free from the burden of unconscious obligation. Individuation, Jung wrote, is about integration. It allows the empath to honor both self and others simultaneously. It is about transforming guilt into wisdom, pressure into freedom, and suppressed potential into creative, purposeful expression. Relationships evolve naturally. Those built on exploitation fade. Those built on care deepen. And the empath, now fully conscious of their own needs, becomes a beacon demonstrating that empathy and self-respect are not contradictory, but mutually reinforcing. This journey also carries collective significance. Jung believed that when empaths embrace their wholeness, they influence the broader social system. They model healthy dynamics, challenge cultural exploitation of sensitivity, and raise the standard of emotional intelligence in their communities. Their example shows that love and care do not require self-abandonment. Individuated empaths become teachers by living authenticity, proving that deep feeling and strong boundaries can coexist. Finally, Jung reminded us that this transformation is a testament to the human spirit. Choosing oneself is not betrayal, it is the highest act of empathy, allowing the gift of sensitivity to serve healing rather than enabling, growth rather than stagnation, authentic connection rather than codependency. If you've been on this journey, if you've finally chosen yourself after years of prioritizing everyone else, comment below. I honor my empathy by protecting it. And don't forget, subscribe to SYC Soul, hit the notification bell, and share this video with anyone who needs to hear this message. Your transformation from unconscious accommodation to conscious compassion is exactly what Jung meant by individuation, becoming who you were always meant to be. Thanks for watching. See you in the next dimension.